Good afternoon and welcome to everybody to our first MED 2020 virtual meeting. The tragic mantra we have been listening in the last 2 months is that the pandemic is affecting and will affect heavily the most vulnerable, individual, states, region. There is no doubt Middle East and North Africa are vulnerable regions after decades of war, instability and socioeconomic shortage, and that the pandemic will further affect, most likely further affect, the economic, political and security landscape also in the Middle East and North Africa. It may also affect diplomatic and political relations with the region, and here comes today's meeting focused on rethinking European engagement in the post-pandemic Middle East. We can count on many of you following us, more than 500, but we can count on a distinguished virtual panel. On top, we have the great pleasure and honor to have with us Marina Sereni, the Italian Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. Deputy Minister, you have the floor for the opening remarks.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you very much. Distinguished guests from the academia, civil society, international organizations and governments, ladies and gentlemen. It is a real pleasure for me to welcome all of you to the very first regional meeting of the Rome-Med Dialogue Initiative. Despite our physical distance, we have made it. I would like to sincerely thank ISPI and the EUA for being our partners in this initiative under the framework of the State of the Union. In this particular moment, we have become aware more than ever about global and regional interdependence. It is therefore crucial for Italy and the EU to project a common positive agenda globally, and with particular regard to their neighborhood, the enlarged Mediterranean region. In this challenging scenario, MED dialogues find a new and strengthening meeting. For this reason, the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation and ISPI are launching a series of virtual events with the key institutional and civil society actors on the major geopolitical, economic and social issues affecting the MENA region. With the explosion of the COVID-19 pandemic, the concept of security has become increasingly affected by its human dimension. The key lesson to take is that healthcare is a global public good. The well-being and good health of European citizens is strictly connected to the one of the people in MENA countries and vice versa. We are not at war. We are fighting a low-intensity conflict against an enemy that is well established in our territory in a way hard to understand and with an extremely high level of mobility. To win such conflict, we need an extraordinary degree of determination, resilience, and solidarity. From the human perspective, the COVID-19 pandemic has erupted in a scenario of ever-increasing severity of global humanitarian needs as a result of enduring armed conflicts, extreme environmental phenomena, as well as pre-existing epidemics. In such context, we are particularly concerned with the impact of COVID-19 in fragile countries with a weak healthcare system. Countries where the number of vulnerable people, such as refugees, migrants, internally displaced persons, returnees, and asylum seekers has been increasing over the last years due to conflicts and instability, as in the case of Africa and in the Mediterranean region. These people are often settled in reception camps or informal settings with extremely precarious sanitary conditions and health services. This makes it difficult to implement the measures necessary to prevent and fight the virus, such as social distancing. Restrictive measures on the movement of goods and people adopted by governments to contain the spread of the virus have hampered the operational and aid delivery capacity of humanitarian organizations. The EU can play a key role in rendering the current international cooperation system fairer and more effective. It can advance its model based on institutional and societal resilience. Moreover, the EU can become a major leader and donor in the global action against the virus, fostering socio-economic resilience in the most fragile and vulnerable areas, with particular regard to the large Mediterranean region and Africa. In this regard, it is important to foster an integrated approach at the EU level to help partner countries and fragile populations in their response to COVID-19. We strongly support the Team Europe approach based on strong coordination and synergies among EU institutions, member states, and development banks and agencies. Italy has also consistently promoted the need for an international alliance to fight COVID-19. We have responded to the UN call to fight the pandemic through extraordinary final contributions to the World Health Organization, to the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, and to the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. Finally, Italy plays a key role in contributing to a transformative multilateral agenda, will play a key role to a transformative multilateral agenda through its G20 chairmanship next year. According to IMF previsions, we are facing the greatest economic recession since 1929, with different levels of severity among countries and income levels. The Mediterranean area is foreseen to go through a contraction of minus 2.8% in GDP growth, while sub-Saharan Africa a minus 1.6 fall in GDP 2020. On top of this, the economies dependent on the production and export of fossil fuels are severely affected by falling oil prices in a context of geopolitical rivalry, diminished global consumption and production. However, despite these looming figures, some opportunities are there. In a context of disruption in global supply chains, where market proximity dynamics are likely to prevail over cost advantages, the enlarged Mediterranean area, strategically positioned between Europe, Asia, and Africa, has the potential to become a major logistic hub, fostering shared regional prosperity. The already existing social fragmentation would worsen in the post-COVID-19 world, both in Europe and in the MENA region. According to the ILO, Arab countries are projected to face the highest drop in working hours in 2020, minus 8.1%. On top of this, the virus tends to have a stronger impact on economically and socially disadvantaged groups, undermining social cohesion. After over a year of social and political turmoil, bringing some positive changes, the square of the enlarged Mediterranean region are now mostly empty. The process of peaceful transformation of societies risks a sudden halt. The virus could favor a return to the status quo or worse. It is therefore important to continue upholding the reformist agenda of the movements in Algeria, Sudan, Lebanon, Iraq, etc. The COVID-19 outbreaks could lead to a humanitarian crisis in the most fragile areas in the MENA region, with weakened healthcare services and limited financial capacity. This is particularly true in the Gaza Strip, the most densely populated place in the world. Refugees and people living in conflict settings, such as Libya and Yemen, are the most vulnerable to the pandemic and must be protected. Italy has continuously provided humanitarian assistance to the most vulnerable people in Libya, Syria, Palestine, and Yemen. Furthermore, the Italian cooperation has directly shipped via Syria, sea or air, necessity goods towards the most affected countries in the region. Italy has supported from its outset the UN Secretary General's appeal for a global ceasefire to contrast the pandemic, both directly and with the EU and the international partners. It is now crucial that regional stakeholders and all parties involved in conflicts seriously commit to it and give peace a chance. In Libya, the UN humanitarian truce was rapidly followed by a quick escalation of fighting over the past few weeks. The continuous use of force on the ground severely undermines any attempt to control ongoing pandemic risks. In Yemen, the UN brokered ceasefire was short-lived. The hostilities between the coalition in support of the legitimate government on one side and the Houthis on the other have not stopped. The recent declaration of autonomy by Southern Transitional Council increases the risk of fragmentation in an already extremely fragile situation. In Syria, after almost 10 years of violence, the population is now confronted with a new, potentially devastating threat in COVID-19, and they have very limited access to life-saving machines and pharmaceuticals. Looming tensions in Idlib and the recent deadly attack in Afrin remind us that the risk of further escalations is real, and the threat of extremism and terrorism, including the recrudescence of Daesh, remains strong. In such context, where even under the COVID-19 crisis, no concrete progress has been achieved, the EU should preserve its role as a constructive player by promoting bilateral dialogue among regional stakeholders and by facilitating all the existing mediation initiatives. When considering the Middle East peace process, the pandemic could also accelerate controversial political maneuvers. The EU must therefore remain vigilant. In this regard, despite strong and noticeable cooperation between Israeli and Palestinian health authorities, the occupation obviously remains the main theme, as well as the continuing threats to the possible annexation of large parts of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley. Should these unilateral actions be implemented, any possibility to resume the peace process and to allow the viability of a two-state solution will be seriously undermined. For this reason, the EU should, in line with the statement recently released by the High Representative Vice President Borrell, continue to monitor these developments and spare no efforts to try to avert such scenario in coordination with the EU, US, and all relevant actors. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by saying that we should become increasingly aware about the far-reaching and long-lasting political, economic, social, and humanitarian consequences that the pandemic can have in the enlarged Mediterranean region as well as in other parts of the world. For this reason, Italy and the EU must not lose their external projector in the area through adequate support and by fostering a positive common agenda with all the key actors involved in the Rome-Med dialogue spirit. In line with their values, Italy and the EU should also continue to support the peaceful requests for reforms brought forward by civic movements in the region: democratization, respect for the rule of law and human rights, economic and social justice, the fight against corruption, sustainability. Thank you and good job for all of us.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Minister. Grazie, Marina. The Deputy Minister has outlined most of the important issue we will be debating and dealing with today. We will now have four panelists, four distinguished panelists I mentioned, which will further frame the issue with a 5-minute kickoff intervention. Since we are discussing the pandemic, I think I would start from Ahmed Al-Madari, who is the Director for Eastern Mediterranean for the WHO. Ahmed, could you shortly, as in all virtual meeting, give us an idea of what the situation is and what you are doing?
Sure, Paolo. Thank you very much for giving us this very great chance to come and share with you, IMRO situation. And thank you very much, Marina, for shedding light on real challenges that we are all facing here in IMRO, particularly those countries with, instabilities and political sort of conflicts. Thank you for sending the very clear message, the message of solidarity, the message of unity to face this challenge, this pandemic together. And we share that message we put as WHO as a whole, our hands on your hands, and we assure you of our full commitment. Anyway, if you don't mind, Paolo, I'd like to share with you this quick presentation. There are many health security challenges that are posed by COVID-19 in EMR. And Marina have mentioned many of these. Like, for example, there was a disruption of non-COVID essential services in all countries here in the region. And we have been repeatedly mentioning this to health authorities and health leaders. And we are making programs for that. There was an economic impact on economic, and job security in the region here because of either lockdown of cities and all countries, shutdown of all factories and industries. So this is a real challenge we are facing. Social impact of the lockdown as well. We have noticed it very seriously happening. And that's why, in fact, we started, working with authorities in different countries and with other UN agencies on issues relevant to this lockdown, like, for example, mental stress and relevant psychological issues. It has impacted this global food security. There are many challenges here happening in the region, particularly countries with instabilities. There was, definitely we noticed that unprepared healthcare systems when it comes into dealing with this pandemic. So that the list of challenges is really huge. Just to share with you the epidemiological data here in IMRO, as you can see, we had up to yesterday a total of 220 positive cases from all IMRO region, 22 countries, ranging from below 100 to about above 100,000 cases, with total death of around 8,250 deaths reported, mainly from Iran. And as you can see, the cumulative case for, the curve is almost stable because of the up and down cases from each individual country. Now, when we talk about IMRO countries without Iran, we notice there is an increase in the number of the positive cases as well as the reported deaths. Maybe one of the reasons for that is the active surveillance strategy that have been followed by many countries, particularly well-resourced countries in the region here, like Gulf countries, like Tunisia, Morocco, Jordan, Egypt, and other countries. Looking at Iran, in fact, we have noticed sort of, decrease of the epidemiological curve for the last 5 weeks. But, if you notice at the end of the right side of the graph, there is a sudden increase of the positive cases. And this was due to easing the public health measures in Iran. And in fact, they have started releasing some of the tough lockdown measures and mass gathering restrictions. That's why we noticed there is an increase in the number of the cases, and we are following it up closely with the health authorities in Iran. Now, when it comes into the pandemic, we have had, one unique approach as a WHO, an approach that asks the government, it is different sectors, either governmental and non-governmental or private sector, coming together and also asking the whole community, individuals and groups of individuals, or the whole community and society to come together. And there is a work between the two, the government and the whole society. So that was the message, we have sent to the government, without which we will not be able to fight the COVID. Now, when it comes into the strategies, as I said, we have a global strategy and we have national strategies. And it is clear from the graph here that, for the global strategy, it is composed of 5 main components: control, suppress, reduce, develop, and mobilize whatever resources, including the communities. When it comes into the national strategies, it starts from coordination and planning, engagement and mobilization of communities, find, test, isolate, and take care of those positive cases, and those tracing of those who are contacting those positive cases, provide whatever clinical care, and adopt the strategy based on the risk and the capacities in each country. Now, when it comes into the risk to humanitarian low capacity settings, as have been mentioned by Marina, it is really huge. We have weak health systems in these settings, in these areas. We have a very big vulnerable group that we need to take care. We have high risk group as well, especially those who are in camps or displaced population. We have a problem of accessing essential supplies, either relevant to the healthcare system like medicines or PPE or diagnostic supplies. We have ongoing humanitarian crisis for operations outside the COVID sort of relevant areas, and continuity of non-COVID-19 health services, as I have mentioned before. Now, when it comes into the transition to post-pandemic state, we have been following it up with each individual country as well as other UN agencies, including as well donors, countries or organizations. So, we have to control the transmission, build the capacity of the healthcare systems, reduce the risk by strengthening the tracing and the surveillance and whatever measures that have been implemented as a public health measures, and engage communities. It is one of the main pillars for our fight against this sort of pandemic. Post-pandemic state, as all experts say, it is not going to be for weeks or months. It may extend for maybe a year or more than a year. So we have to accommodate ourselves. We have to accommodate ourselves to the new world, to the new norm, as they say. Potential impact, as it has been mentioned, many, including uncertainty of future of the pandemic itself, extended global recession with its impact on the economy and the social and other dimensions of life, major setback to the SDGs achievements that have been done in the past. Now we have to relook at it. And last is, sharing the success stories when it comes into bringing all leaders into this sort of fight against this pandemic. All leaders are there, and we have seen it ourselves at regional, national, and global levels. Solidarity and partnership, as Marina have mentioned, we really appreciate the support that have been given by Italy in specific, but to the European Union in general, to IMRO states and other donors. It is really appreciated. The utilization of the influenza pandemic, experience in the past, it has been well utilized by different countries. We created a very strong risk communication strategy in collaboration with many other agencies like UNICEF, for example. We have had an effective diagnostic capacities. Yes, we are facing difficulty of securing these diagnostic capacities or, kits and tools, but still we feel, in a very quick manner, we managed to get the right tools to help us. We invented a lot, in digital and IT, and the time has come for its utilization. And this meeting, as you said, Paulo, this is a very good example and reflection of how IT can be utilized. And I'm sure this sort of new norm is going to be with us forever, And working with, many partners, like Quran partner, we have been working with them very closely. They helped us in sending their experts, like, for example, to Iran during the technical mission, and some other countries here in the region. And last is the service continuity that we have to make sure, those group of people who are receiving their service will not be cut short of that service, like maternal services, child health services, patients suffering from TB, from HIV will continue getting service. Thank you very much, Paulo, and I'm very sorry if I am quick and I took long time.
No, it's always, thank you, Ahmed. It's always unpleasant to interrupt interesting presentation. But in a virtual meeting is also more difficult because I didn't know how to reach you. For the next panelist, I will signals when 1 minute is left, because I want to get one of the good point of this virtual meeting is that we can get questions from all over the world and get back to you. I will now move to Maha Yaya, who is the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Lebanon. Because Maha, before we started, before we went on air, we were commenting among us, and Randa told us that 25% of the American workforce is unemployed, and I reacted saying this is the average always in the south of Italy among young people and also in many of the countries. So, but the big issue is that this 25% will most likely become 50%. So please tell us something on the humanitarian risk and costs of what's going on, as Ahmed already mentioned. You have the floor, Maha.
Thank you, Paolo, and thank you for convening this panel together and inviting me to be on it. It's a pleasure to actually even see you virtually. I'm happy Italy is coming out of the dark tunnel that it's been for quite some time now. Just on before we get into the humanitarian costs, to take a step back and look at some of the forecasts. In January, there was a forecast that the world economy could contract by 11% in the first half of 2020 and lose about 6 trillion in economic output as a result of the pandemic. That number is probably increased by now. The IMF is saying that the Mena economies will shrink by 3.3% during 2020. So it's even worse than what was predicted before. Now, when it comes to MENA countries, the issue is, as Her Excellency mentioned, the question is not just the number of people who are becoming unemployed. Yes, it could reach 50% of unemployment. We're already seeing mass layoffs across the region, particularly in countries like Lebanon, where we already had an economic crisis prior to the pandemic. But in places like, for example, Syria, Libya, Yemen, where you have an ongoing conflict, the crisis is such that already a large portion of the population was either displaced or refugees. There are 70 million refugees around the world. Half of those are, and internally displaced, excuse me. That's almost like a small country. Half of those are in the MENA region. These are people who have little access to health services. They are mostly without a job and dependent on aid. Many of them, if they do work, they work in the informal sector. Therefore, they have no social protection whatsoever. And with the lockdown measures, they've been forced to stay at home. Now, you add to that the large number, I mean, there are 70 billion people who work in the informal sector around the world. The MENA has a huge number. We don't know exactly how many because there's never been an accurate compilation of how many people there are in this region who work in the informal sector. But there are different percentages for Egypt, for Tunisia, ranging from 38% of the workforce to 42%, depending on who you're talking to. The bottom line is, again, these are people, these are the vegetable vendors, they're the taxi drivers who are not able to go, I mean, they're being given a choice, and they've said this, we're being asked to die of hunger or to die of COVID-19. If we don't work, we cannot put food for our families on the table. Now, what normally would have happened and what is happening around the world in other countries is that governments are kicking in and providing the needed, if you like, conditional cash transfers or direct cash transfers to support these families during this period. In MENA countries, particularly those where, as again, in conflict countries or in countries that were already fragile like Lebanon, and the fiscal space doesn't exist, that process has become almost impossible. So literally, we're beginning to see cases of malnutrition. We're beginning to see a lot of the ripple effects of people not being able to eat properly. there are projections that poverty in this region is likely to increase tremendously. We're not quite sure yet by how much, but it's going to be a significant increase. Where they're talking about 50 to 60 million, the number of people reaching that are determined to be poor. In conjunction with this, if we are to also look at additional factors of fragility in this region, in addition to conflict, rather than seeing a roll down, a kind of a backtracking in conflict, we're seeing an intensification of the conflicts in some places, because the participants or the stakeholders on the ground are seeing this as an opportunity to push forward their own political agendas. For example, in Syria, the Russians and the Chinese, that's not conflict, but we've seen them try and push for a lifting of sanctions against the regime of Bashar al-Assad. In other places, we're seeing, in Iraq, for example, we're seeing ISIS rear its ugly head again and try and take advantage of power vacuums on the ground because of COVID-19 and the lockdown measures associated with it. So this is also quite critical at this particular point in time because it does create a...
Maha, 1 minute. 1 minute.
I will then end with 2 points. One is that the COVID-19 is also highlighted, as I was outlining, in terms of poverty, in terms of access to health, insurance, social protection. COVID-19 has highlighted some of the structural inequalities in this region, particularly around access to healthcare, income, opportunity, etc. And it's brought them into much sharper focus and will become a big issue. Finally, it's going to create significant challenges for governance in the medium to long term, because the carrot and stick approach that was, around before is no longer viable. The stick was more or less challenged in a very big way in 2011, and even though they're still coming back to the security apparatus over and over again in different countries, the barrier of fear is broken, and we see this in the different protests. And I agree with the minister, deputy minister, that we need to try and support these protests and their demands to the extent possible. And the carrot is no longer possible because with the decline of the oil prices, the fiscal space to try and buy people off is simply no longer there. I will stop here and we can extend later.
Thank you, Maha. Thank you very much. We will go back to this issue very soon with the question and answer session. You anticipated, as well as Deputy Minister Marina Sereni, that what we have described so far will have and is having an impact on the political situation, already fragile, and on conflict. You mentioned an intensification of conflict, and you gave us a few examples. Randa Slim is the director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogue Program at the Middle East Institute in Washington. Could you, Randa, elaborate more on these political and security implications?
Yes, good morning, everybody, at least from my end of the world, from this part of the world, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you, Paulo, good to see you. Thank you for ISPI for inviting me to be on this panel, and honored to be on this panel with the other colleagues. You know, I have been looking at data and literature on this epidemic to conflict relationship, especially whether there have been studies that have been done on how epidemics contribute to conflict and whether in some cases they cause conflict. And to be very honest, there is not a lot of rigorous academic research on this, especially using econometric models. A lot of the research has been done around the HIV/AIDS epidemic and their impact on African countries. There was one study in 2006 which used a strong econometric model, which provided strong evidence of a causal link between HIV and the prevalence of civil conflict and civil disorder in 112 countries. However, all of this research seems to indicate that the impact of an epidemic on security and conflict usually goes through three channels. One of them is the political channel, the second is the economic channel, and the third is the social channel. And I think both, all previous speakers, the three previous speakers highlighted already some elements of these three, of the factors in each of these channels. For example, in the political arena, let me focus on how, for example, epidemics affects the social cohesion of leading elites, especially if these epidemic protract and governments are unable to provide services or prove to be inadequate. So there will be a lot of name blaming and scapegoating within the ruling elites for the performance of the government. In the case of the Middle East, on the political level is, for example, the social contract, the impact on the social contract, even in GCC countries. Citizens are accustomed to certain benefits from the government. The COVID epidemic, its impact on the economic downturn, the uncertainty of when the global economy and global demand for oil will pick up again, which is not likely to happen in the near term to medium term, is going to really test that social contract that has bound citizens and government in GCC countries. And that might create tensions in countries which have been seen stable, pretty much stable for now. On the social level, for example, and Maha referred to that, about the increasing inequality. I think what the epidemic showed is exacerbate and highlight and deepen this existing inequality. For example, let's take lockdown. There are only groups in society and small groups of societies that can afford to telecommute or that can afford to have their kids get schooling on the internet, that can afford to stay at home and weather the financial setback. And so what you are going to see is that marginalized, vulnerable communities, IDPs, refugees, but also youth, women, people with disabilities, they are going to be even more affected. And again, research shows that the one impact of the epidemic is on social cohesion, on social inequality, by exacerbating social inequality, and that's a driver for long-term conflict. Now, on the economic side, and I think Maha referred to that, you are going to have countries that are already in a fragile situation economically because of years of conflict, and so they have no capacities almost to deal with, to provide the resources needed to help their citizens, their SMEs, weather the financial implication of COVID. But also on the economic side, you have countries that are job producing, that are labor exporting, that are middle income, Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, that are going to suffer from the drop in remittances from their expats in GCC countries, as GCC countries tighten their belts and start basically firing foreign workers, and also the drop in tourism dollars. A big percentage of the economies of Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco comes from tourism dollar. So that's going to have impact, of course, on unemployment, but also on stability. One last point, and Maha referred to that, is what we are going to see in terms of contestation of the authority and legitimacy of the state. And we are going to see that happen from groups like ISIS, as we have seen recently in Syria and Iraq, but also we are going to see it from groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, from groups like PMF in Iraq, who have access to resources and are going to basically come in and try to fill the economic void that usually has been, caused by the impact of the epidemic on the country's finances where they operate. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Randa. Thank you very much. It's a gloomy scenario. From the three presentations, what came out is a really gloomy scenario. And we are facing in all our countries a very gloomy situation. And at ISPI, what we are trying to do, and it's not always easy, is to keep the light on other parts of the world which are facing at the same time a difficult situation. And as Ahmed said, and everybody said, we have to cooperate even if we are facing difficult situation, as Deputy Minister mentioned at the very beginning. Now we are moving to the last panelist, Stefano Manservisi, who has been Director General for International Cooperation and Development. He has been everything at the European Commission. He is now a distinguished fellow at the CGD and the ODI. Stefano, the title of our meeting is Rethinking the European Engagement in the Middle East. Some may even question there is an engagement, at least at political level, versus other actors. And some may question or may underline that we have been talking about rethinking the European engagement many times after the Barcelona process, after the Arab Spring, after the terrorist ISIS and so on. I'm sure you will be able to convince us that this is not true and this is the right moment.
Well, thank you, Paolo, and thank you to Marina and to all the other speakers, because after the introductions and the pictures, then my job is on one side much more difficult, precisely because I have to try and indicate some tendencies in the Union. On the other side, easier because I have not to repeat a certain number of things. I think that from the European point of view, that in this moment I'm not representing, therefore I keep a bit of freedom also in describing what the Union is doing. I would like to, let's say, recall what it has been done today, now, and what is the challenges which are ahead. First, what has been done? Well, the Union has mobilized 2.1 billion euros quite quickly. It's not new money. Let's be clear. It's not new money. It's money which has been reprogrammed, reoriented in agreement with the partners, meaning therefore sound dialogue, in order to address essentially the three dimensions of the first, let's say, hit on the countries. I mean, the first one is the humanitarian aspect. It's the fact that there are needs of supplies, needs of material, needs of help in order for people to survive and to cope with the impact. The second one is on the health sector, obviously, because not just to supply, is to keep them up, and to make sure that these sectors can become resilient in front of something which is supposed to last. In any case, we don't know now how long. And the third, exactly like in Europe, is the fiscal space. Is the introduction it's the help to the economies to remain more or less afloat, to keep employment. So in any case, to intervene from this point of view. Therefore, 2.1 billions with the gathering together of all possible instruments that we have. That the toolbox of the Union is fragmented. It's not one. And therefore, the effort to put together the different sources in order to target all the three issues that I underlined, was particularly important, including mobilizing in the quickest way. First, not inventing new channels, but working a lot with WHO, responding to the call of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, responding to the call of the UN. So making at the same time something which is not creating new structure and underlining the multilateral approach of the Union. And therefore, let's say the partnership, natural partnership with the UN institution, and where all the partners should be together, like the G20, etc. So therefore, this was the approach. And the mobilization through budget support and macro-financial assistance. I would like to recall that Tunisia is benefiting from 600 million of macro-financial assistance, which means, cash in terms of grants or hyper concessional loans into the budget of the state, because the best way is to help the fiscal space in the country. So therefore, all this has been done quite quickly, but with existing money, multilateral approach, following the call, not inventing anything, sound dialogue in order to put money, like in our experience in Europe, in order to enlarge the fiscal space that these states have. At the same time, working in the framework of the IMF, the G20 and the World Bank in order to address the issue of debt, which is also, let's say, very important in the MENA region, which is adding fragility to fragility, because obviously the fiscal space is not just the cash of today, but is also the capability of getting on the market in order to have more. And therefore, the EU, in particular EU member state of Euro area, are working as much as possible in the IMF and in the World Bank in order to contribute to something which has just started, because the discussion about debt has just started, and the decision taken by the G20 to postpone, the payment of the service is, in my opinion, totally insufficient, and therefore this must be, let's say, rolled over, and we have to discuss much more. But I think that there is now what next, because this was an important effort, but what next? I mean, what next is not only an issue for the MENA region, is an issue for the European Union. Because if the European Union, in setting up its own recovery plan, plays or makes a choices, which is of not understanding that the recovery of the Union is intimately linked with the recovery as a priority of the countries in the MENA region, then there will be a problem. Therefore, this will imply that, let's see what will be the proposal of the multi-annual financial framework that the Commission reshaped will propose. As I hope, as a minimum, that it remains the amount increased for the region, which were just foreseen before. But I hope that they will be increased, because if the Union doesn't understand or doesn't give sign, that its own recovery is extremely linked with the recovery of this region, then there will be, in my view, a political problem and a huge mistake. Something that should quite quickly, let's say, push to rethink what is the neighborhood, actually. I mean, the neighborhood policy, since its inception in 2002, say, has remained more or less the same, based on one assumption: a rich and prosperous Europe, enlarged to the maximum, and then let's organize all the others around this in order to, let's say, allow sharing a bit and not enlarging further. This was the basic approach of the neighborhood policy. Now, this worked a bit at the beginning. In my personal view, it didn't work in the more recent time, because we are living in one of the most unstable areas of the world. Therefore, not everything is responsibility of the Union, but certainly the Union has not played visibly, the kind of role that it planned to have. So therefore, it's not just a question of money, which is important, extremely important, but it's a question of model to be discussed. Because, I think that in the moment when Europe, for example, is rethinking, let's say, the position of Europe in the international trade, in the organization of the supply chain, on the definition of what is strategic and what is less strategic, in the sense of creating, let's say, areas of stability in terms of cohesion, in terms of perspective, in terms of the drivers for growth, like digital economy, for example, and Green Deal, this kind of issue will become, or should become, rather, the real new field on which to build a new neighborhood policy. A neighborhood policy which, in my view, should be part of redefinition of what Europe could be as a standing, not alone, but as a standing on its own foot, in a world which is multipolar, in a world which, without playing now too far away, but with the United States, with China, with Russia, with others which are in any case competing for influence, for models, for capacity of credibility, Well, I think that if the European Union is missing, you know, after the injection of money, after the construction of
1 minute.
Let's say, of a more sustainable plan, if it dissociates itself from the definition of the solution that Europe will have to find in order to be better equipped to stand in this multipolar but still ungoverned world, you know, and it dissociates itself from a project to be discussed with the MENA partners as a priority, well, this will be a mistake. And I think that this will be, it's the real challenge that the Union has in front in the next months, I would say. Is a question of investment, is a question of dialogue, is a question of redefining a bit what is keeping us together. And therefore, you know, the issue of stability, of peace, of fragility, of poverty, of poor social cohesion, you know, cannot be dissociated. You know, maybe supply chains could be redesigned in order to be shorter, in order to have more protagonism. And it's not just to say, let's participate to our internal market. I mean, the internal market of the Union is under stress. Everybody's seeing that in this day, you know, with even a sort of risk of its existence. Now, if the internal market of the European Union after the crisis will have to be built not only as a free space, but also as an industrial policy program, well, this should be discussed with the MENA countries, and this should be discussed in order to have an area which is much more integrated. This is what I think it's the challenge that we have in front of us in the next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. Thank you very much. We have received many questions, and I will try to pick up one for each. Dove le vedo? 1 second, because I can't see them. Okay. There is one question for, I will mention all of them and then give you the floor for a short comment. A question for Randa. Can coronavirus decrease dynamic of war situation in Syria? Then a question for Maha. How will coronavirus reshape popular protests across the region, and in particular in Lebanon? For Stefano, the European Union has approved a mission in Libya. How is the crisis going to affect it? This is a tough question. And then there is a question for Ahmed. How much is Ramadan affecting the spread of the virus? There is some reference to the situation in Cairo, to the poorest area in the city, where lockdown is not respected and not controlled. So will this affect the trend that you described at the very beginning of your presentation? Please, Randa.
Yes, thank you very much. Look, in general, again, studies about conflict, the impact of epidemics and conflict talk in terms of whether it reduces conflict or increases conflict. There are contrasting opinions on this. There are academics as well as policy analysts who say, you know, because the economies shrink, because parties have less access to resources, they are going to be less willing to wage war or to continue in a war. That's one argument. There is another argument that say, in fact, no, because of the economic difficulties at home, parties will be more motivated to wage more wars, to deflect attention from it. And also there is the war economy, is that as the national economy fragments, the war economy then becomes more of an incentive to continue the war because it provides benefits to the warring parties. In the case of Syria, I think we have a number of parties who are going to be influenced by the developments in a different way. So you're going to have groups like, for example, the regime, as well as maybe some of its backers who think the epidemic create conditions that should incentivize them to gain more ground and proceed further. You have a group like ISIS, which we have seen early April wage one of the most coordinated, sophisticated attack in the Badia region. And so see the vacuum created by the epidemic as being, again, an incentive to regroup and regain ground. And then you have the external actors like Turkey, Russia, Iran, that have maybe different incentives. You know, we are seeing already reports of Iran pulling some of its forces out. Russia is increasingly worried about how the epidemic is going to affect its forces on the ground. You know, Turkey, we're already seeing Turkish soldiers, being infected by COVID, and then maybe eventually transfer that into the refugee. So in my opinion, all in all, if I put all of these together, this assemblage, I think the likelihood is that this conflict will continue and we're going to see ebb and flow. We have seen recently a lull, a pause in the violence, but we are going to see that go up again. And I think, in my opinion, if we put all these factors together, in fact, there will be more incentives for the different parties, local and regional, to continue waging this war, having calculated that the epidemic is in their favor.
Thank you, Randa. Maya, your question is on the protest and the implication for Lebanon, but let me add to you and to the other that someone is asking also for a short comment on which country do you see more at risk at the end of the whole situation in the region, the one with less resilient or more economically and politically at risk. So 2 questions in one.
I'll start with the second one, Paolo. I would say, obviously countries in conflict are the most at risk, but I would now also add Lebanon to the mix, because Lebanon is already facing a catastrophic economic meltdown, a crisis of political legitimacy. Its entire political system is in question, and now a health crisis, a pandemic, which has aggravated the economic meltdown that was happening way before Corona began. Just to give an example, protests broke out on the streets in October. Between October and December, something like 220,000 people had lost their jobs. Businesses are closing left, right, and center. The banking sector, which was one of the key pillars in the Lebanese system, is under threat. Recently, the government put out a plan which talks about $83 billion in losses to the banking sector. And the central bank, which normally would have been the one institution to step in and support, provide stimulus, economic stimulus, this is what's happening elsewhere, to provide economic stimulus for businesses to restart again, is unable to do it because it itself has a deficit. So it's a real mess. Inflation is skyrocketing. We've seen the price of basic goods like sugar, for example, increase by 67% between March 2019 and March 2020. Same with rice, with salt. So really basic goods, we're seeing a doubling and tripling and quadrupling of prices depending. Now, in terms of the protest movements in this context, I think that we're going to see 3 kinds of transformations. One has already happened. We've seen a lot of organizations and individuals involved in protest movements in places like Lebanon and Iraq move to the humanitarian space. The COVID-19 has, and we see this in every crisis, people leave what they're doing and they move into the humanitarian space because people's lives are now at risk. So we've seen people set up food banks in Lebanon, for example, trying to make sure that families get their weekly rations, and this is all on the privately donated. This is not sustainable. It's great, it's fantastic, it's a good bridging mechanism, but it's not sustainable in the long run. The other way I see protest movements already also change is they're moving, as we are, to the online world even more. So there are discussions now happening online in Lebanon, in Iraq, and other places between different groups of protesters. They're trying to establish, these are networks that were already established, but to try and see what would the next step be. How do you then move from a social movement to, which has a lot of people, to a movement that is able to impact political change. So this has nothing to do with COVID-19, but COVID-19 again has intensified that discussion and forced them to try and think creatively about this. And I'm already seeing in Lebanon, for example, some of these groups moving towards institutionalization, creation of political entities. I won't say political parties, but entities. One last comment.
Yeah.
One last comment is we will also see some of these movements become more violent. We're already seeing this in Lebanon, unfortunately, because as the situation becomes more dire, as people are losing their jobs, they have no way of feeding their families, they're losing hope, then more and more people are, I mean, the kind of people moving to the streets now, we are already seeing more violence in that at that level. And my concern is that if in a country like Lebanon, where there are weak state institutions, this can create power vacuums in places where the political parties are not able to step in, and we may have serious security repercussions emerging from that. I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Ahmed, the question for you is how will Ramadan affect? It's an issue, religion and coronavirus is an issue everywhere. Also in my country, there has been debate on how to stop and how to avoid spreading of the virus. What's your reply to the question?
Thank you, Paolo, for this important question. In fact, as you all know, I mean, Ramadan is strongly linked with, specific behaviors and features that are mainly linked with mass gatherings, starting from, activities like breaking the fast together as a small families or big gatherings, coming for prayers as a small group or a large mega groups like what is happening in Saudi Arabia, for example. So based on that sort of fear we have during Ramadan, we started weeks before Ramadan, in fact, negotiating and discussing with some Islamic groups like the Islamic Advisory Group, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and we worked on developing documents in close collaboration, between us and in WHO and the Islamic Advisory Group and scholars. That document was, working as a guiding document to countries, telling them what are, and communities and individuals, what is the best way of dealing with this year Ramadan, the new way of doing our sort of rituals during this new Ramadan with COVID-19. Based on that guiding document, in fact, many countries, even ahead of that document, have taken tough measures when it comes into postponing, a lot of mass gathering, canceling these mass gatherings, like, for example, closure of mosques and the closure of, this mass breaking the fast. Most of the countries and most of the communities adhere to that. But unfortunately, one of the main challenge, some of these communities did not adhere to that sort of recommendation. I totally agree with you that this put us in the risk of spreading more the COVID-19 infection. But in spite of that, we insisted by sending various messages using various tools, either TV channels, newspapers, social media, targeting individuals and groups of individuals and families. The risk is there, but it is much better, if I can say, when it comes into the mass gathering compared to last year with no COVID. With COVID-19, it is much better, but still the risk is there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is now the easy question for Stefano. Then I have one question also for Deputy Minister Marina Sereni, but since she will give closing remarks, I will get the question at that point. Stefano, please.
Well, I think I will respect the time allowed, because otherwise it will take years and it will be quite difficult. But let's say, I guess that the mission, which is the subject of the question, is the Irini one, no? Is the successor of Sophia mission in particular. Well, first, I think that on a situation like Libya, COVID will accelerate process and make them more complicated. It's not that they're changing, dramatically, Simply, they will attract interest and urgency for action, I hope, much more. It's not just a question of containment, the Iranian mission is to fight against the struggle of arms and oils, etc., or what is illegal, is to enforce the embargo, and also to rebuild some form of common management of the management of the border on the sea from the European Union. But in itself, even if the starting point is positive, is in reality a bit weaker than the Sophia as it was considered at the beginning. Now, COVID will simply accelerate some form of contradictions in order to do much more. The mission in itself is not, in my view, the test for the impact of the virus. Is rather the acceleration of the process inside the country and in the countries which are, in fact, covering the different factions which are fighting in Libya. So the mission is a revelator. But what is the real issue for the European Union, in my view, is not only to help in finding a new mediator of UN, which would be a good thing. You know, I regret personally that Rantan Lamamra, who was suggested by Guterres, has not been chosen, but nationality for some, but the man was top and was able to do many things. In any case, first, the Union should be on the forefront to help in finding somebody credible, because this is usually important. Second, allow me to say that the Union, going even beyond Irini, should take its own responsibility. You know, there was a ceasefire which has been concluded. You know, it seemed to me that apart from talking about the security, the European army, etc., there should have been immediately things that the Europeans should have done to put European troops monitoring this ceasefire. Otherwise, useless that we complain that the Turks and the Russians are doing. You know, I mean, Libya is in front of Europe, is part of the Mena region, is part of this area on which the security, the prosperity, and the stability of Europe itself is at stake. One day we can call it migrant, the other day we can call it terrorism, another day we can call it economic development because of oil. But in reality, this is the issue at stake. And I think that if COVID can suggest something, is to step up a bit, you know, and therefore to take that in a more, let's say, politically active, less declaration, a bit more action. I mean, what the Union is doing is correct, basically. I don't question that. But you know, I mean, Libya is a territory now of a proxy war, and you know what I mean. You know, between two camps. You know, is of yesterday the news of new troops, 100 of servicemen of Wagner, which are there, which are countered by new people coming from Syria, brought by the other side. You know, do we want really to have another Somalia with, let's say, a proxy war managed by others in front of our shores? Do we want this country to implode? I mean, definitely. I mean, we made the choice to support a government which is not controlling big part of the country. So let's make something. Irini, it's important. Irini, allow me to say, is more important for the Europeans to find again a common ground to, let's say, fight against smuggling and maybe to manage migration a different way, a bit less for Libya itself. Now, I think what is missing, and maybe COVID will suggest, because certainly this will amplify the crisis within Libya and maybe some horrors which used to happen also in the country because of the refugees, because of the migrants, etc., and maybe to suggest to the Europeans a bit more proactive. And I'm not, favor of war, intervention, etc. But if the Europeans are serious, they have to be on the ground in order to ensure ceasefire and to ensure mediation in support to the UN, but in a more proactive way.
Thank you, Stefano. And I will now turn to Deputy Minister Marina Sereni, which I don't see right now. So I will take one other question which was left. Someone asked whether the coronavirus crisis will stimulate in the region. Oh, sorry, Marina, but let me have this question anyhow to Maya. will the coronavirus increase rejection even in the region of refugees?
Okay, yes. I'm not sure that, I mean, there is already an anti-refugee sentiment in different countries, but I haven't seen an intensification in that sentiment during this coronavirus. The concern has been, the stigmatization has been that refugee centers, settlements are most likely to become hotbeds of infection. This is the stigma. That hasn't happened. I take Lebanon, for example, or Jordan, where in Jordan you have actual camps, and in Lebanon, where you have a lot of informal settlements, we have not seen the large them becoming hotbeds of infection. Now, the challenge always is we don't know the extent to which there is testing, etc. In fact, there's only some cases were found in a refugee camp in the Bekaa. So yes, I mean, sentiment and reality are two different things, as is often the case.
Yeah. But that looks like one of the very few good news in the entire hour we spent together. I wonder if Deputy Minister is with us, because this time I will not have another question ready for you. She is not. So I have one question to Ahmed, which came before. What, from your standpoint, from the sanitary situation, the most urgent, most needed tool that is missing for you to face this situation?
Thank you for this tough question. You mean for the 22 countries here in EMRO, if you talk about the 22 countries, one of the top listed, and I hope it will be seriously taken by all countries in the region here, is let us put aside all our political differences. Let us put aside all political differences and come together to fight this pandemic. As have been mentioned by colleagues, out of the 22 countries, 12 countries, almost 12 countries are facing, suffering from either protracted emergencies and conflicts or acute emergencies and conflicts. That, the amount of destruction in these countries is really huge. Some of these countries, before the Arabic, Spring, some of these countries were just steps away from the Millennium Developmental Goals to reach. Go to them now, you will see they are 100 years back from the SDGs. So my main message is, those leaders, those different authoritarians in these countries, in one country we have maybe 3 or 2 leaders or authorities. Let us come together. Let us work together to serve the humankind, to save, the lives of people. Otherwise, we will not be able to succeed in fighting this pandemic, and the test for us is very difficult, and we will lose. And generations either will remember us for the good or the bad if we do not come together, in fighting this pandemic, putting aside all differences, societal, political, economical differences. So that is the top thing that I wanted.
I have another question in the meantime. No, wait. Marina, sorry, I was ready to give you the floor, and let me have one question for you as well. How should the European Union react to the annexation of part of the West Bank and Jordan announced by Israel and the United States with the deal of the century?
For react, I think we have to prevent. It's very difficult to change the situation if unilateral steps will be taken. So I think, and we are pushing in our partners in Europe to do this, to make steps now towards the Israeli new government to prevent the idea of annexation, because, when annexation is taken, it's a very big mess, and it's very difficult to revert the situation. So I think that I know that our ambassador with the other colleagues in Tel Aviv, in Israel, made already a step towards the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel to put on the table this position. Please don't make any unilateral step about annexation, and please stop also the new settlements, you know, around Jerusalem, because they are illegal. But now we have to wait because we do not have a new government yet, even if it will be in a few days. And I think we should be, as Europeans, united on the traditional position of Europe. You know, it's not easy because some countries have a different sensitivity on this, but it's very important that the European Union stick with the traditional position and will prevent the idea of unilateral annexation. Our position is this one, and we will do all our best to have this unity of Europe on this point.
Marina, would you like to have a closing remark apart from the question?
I don't know, perhaps only to thank all of you. I'm staying here. I'm sorry because I had the telephone call before, so for 2 times you called me and I was in the room but not hearing you. But I'm staying here till the end of the seminar. So, but perhaps just to greet you and to thank you for this very interesting discussion.
Thank you, Marina, but this is the end. Meaning
that... Okay. So I didn't understand because I was there just calling, just with a telephone call. Okay, thank you. Thank you. All of you have had points that are very interesting and very useful for us, for the political side of this webinar. We want to continue to work on the Med Dialogue events. I hope very much that in some way in December we will be able to have the meetings in some way, and perhaps different, as you told at the beginning, perhaps in a different way than in the past years. But I hope very much that the Med Dialogue could continue and could see you in Rome, all of you in Rome. Thank you for the meeting, and I will continue to follow also the seminars that we will organize in the next weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Deputy Minister, and thank you for closing with a positive note. I mean, all of you who have been at the hotel in Rome where we host Med and know the corridor. My most is my worry is to imagine social distancing in that corridor. But
nightmare.
Nightmares, yes. Thank you, not ghost. A dark picture came out, and we knew that. But in dark time, we keep our lights on, and in dark time, Med keeps the light on the Mediterranean and North Africa. We have always done that, even more so now that the time is dark everywhere, especially in this region so close for many reasons to us. I wish to thank all of you. I wish to thank the State of the Union Initiative and the European University Institute, which have been partner of this webinar, and see you soon with the other initiative of Med Virtual. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Paolo.
Grazie.
Thank you. Bye.
See you in Rome.
Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao a tutti.
Miranda.
Bye.
Ciao.